you so much, Annie. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks for everyone for attending this webinar this evening. There's 103 people online, which is very exciting. I'm thrilled to be presenting on my book, Living with Wildlife, A Guide for Our Homes and Backyards. Before I get any further, I'd also like to acknowledge and extend my appreciation for the Dja Dja Wurrung, the traditional owners of the land upon which I call from today. And this is where I researched and wrote the book. I'd like to pay my respects to the leaders and elders, past, present, and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture, and the hopes of all the Dja Dja Wurrung people. This is the Wombat Forest near Belato, which is just up the road from me. So the format of tonight, I thought I'd introduce myself, kind of the background around the book and some of the themes in the book, and then we'd get into a few practical examples. And because it's a bird's meet, obviously I won't be talking about wombats or pythons or grey-headed flying foxes and all the other wonderful animals that are featured in the book. I'll just be focusing on the birds. So how did it all begin? Here, this is me as a, I think 10 or 11-year-old with my giant binoculars. Like so many of you that are interested in nature, was hooked at a very young age, and it's been a lifelong thing for me. And I thought I'd share with you two of my most major influences in my writing and also in my approach to my work. So many of you are familiar with Sir David Attenborough, of course, as a really amazing broadcaster, but he really impressed upon me his writing. So he's actually a really, really great writer. And what I loved about Sir David's writing is that he uses evolution and ecology, and he writes in this engaging kind of narrative way. It pulls you into the story of animals and what they're doing, leading their lives, living, breeding, feeding. And he doesn't anthropomorphize, but he really makes them like just living characters that they all have stuff to do. You know what I mean? They've got these lives that run concurrent and at the same time as humans. And that really meant a lot to me. And then the other person that really influenced my work is Gerald Durrell. So he's quite famous because of his books, My Family and Other Animals. But I really used this book, The Amateur Naturalist, as a guide to becoming a field naturalist, learning how to observe, record, and most importantly, appreciate the world around me. And because one of the things that Gerald Durrell really emphasizes is that nature is really cool and interesting and exciting, not just out in reserves or so-called natural areas or away when you're camping. In this book, The Amateur Naturalist, he covers like woodlands and streams and forests and oceans, but there's also a whole section on house, the animals you find in and around your house, and backyards as well. And I've taken that approach throughout my work as a field naturalist and educator. And so when I moved up to the Dalesford area in Victoria in the forest, I started writing in my local paper. And in 2013, I published this book locally, and it's a collection of all the articles that I was writing about the common things that people could see when they're hanging out the washing, or because there's a certain thing happening at a time of year, like the wildflowers flowering or migratory birds visiting. And because I'm really interested in how people coexist with wildlife, I'd include tips on practicalities of our encounters with wildlife, like birds attacking windows and the like. And so for those of you who live in rural areas, you know, when you write for the local paper, so I'd get questions all the time. Tanya, what do I do? What's happening with this? What does this mean? What is this bird? And so I was answering all these questions. And so when CSIRO Publishing, I write reviews for them, they were like, have you got any book ideas? I was like, oh, you bet I do. So in 2021, in crazy COVID times, I pitched a book idea to Brianna from CSIRO Publishing, and it was accepted. And then I did 3 years of researching and writing and came up with this. Ta-da! So Anne Jones describes it as Australia-wide and bright-eyed guide to the best housemates ever, wildlife. And I love that description because it speaks a lot to the joy we have about the animals that live around us. And so that's one audience for the book, but another audience for the book are people who are possibly a bit annoyed at the creatures in their backyard. Maybe cockatoos are destroying things, or they're not sure what to do with the possum in their roof. Or maybe they're frightened. They're frightened of a big male kangaroo or a huge cassowary in the garden. And then obviously, most of the listeners here would know that people know that wildlife is in trouble. You know, there's a lot of pressures. And so I have a whole section on helping wildlife in trouble as well. Another of the inspirations for the book was the Gardens for Wildlife program. This is my local program. And in that, because I'm in the Hepburn Shire, and Gardens for Wildlife give participants really good information on planting Indigenous plants and maybe having rocks for lizards and providing water. And the wildlife encounter bit is usually a page or two at the end of a booklet. And I was like, no, 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 let's put wildlife first because wildlife needs our help. And in this next slide, I'll go into a bit about that, because what I did, I really love science and research. So I was like, okay, I'm going to look at the scientific literature and just trawl through all of the data and reports that are coming in about the reasons that wildlife end up needing to be rescued or come into care. So what we've got here is we know that bushfires, floods, and other natural disasters, you know, during Black Summer or during floods, we see all these really shocking images of dead birds or burnt koalas and the like. And so people are galvanized to help. But what I really found that was, pardon me, so apparent about the what's happening to wildlife is that it's actually the everyday effects. So it's known as anthropogenic effects. That means that it's human caused. And the leading causes for wildlife coming into care were car strike or like car collision, entanglement, that's like fences, netting, attack by pets. And of course, cats get a lot of press, but dogs are very much a problem, some dogs for some wildlife, and also disease. And these effects multiply when we are increasing in our population and we're spreading out. And so what happens is that you might have a bushland area that's cleared, and then there's a suburb in its place. So once the suburb is there, then there's more pools for koalas to drown in, or more cats and things like that. Then all of these things are exacerbated by climate breakdown, the ferocious climate and the stresses. And so it ends up creating this situation whereby year by year, wildlife hospitals and rescue organizations are actually reporting an increase which is really unfortunate because they're very, very tired and overworked. So this photo here is from Bonorong Wildlife Hospital. Greg, the CEO, was fantastic for and had an interview, and he was really great. They train, I think, 10,000 people a year in how to be wildlife rescuers, transporters, or just how to do wildlife first aid. But when we look at all the reasons that animals are going into care, because they're human caused, that means that we can actually change this. We can make a difference. And so he used the term wildlife preventers, which I love. What it means is that we're preventing the wildlife from getting into I call it the wildlife rescue ecosystem. So if we do the right thing by wildlife around our homes and backyards, then we're keeping them out of that system. And so what could we call this? And looking at human wildlife conflict, which is what it used to be called, they've actually shifted that feeling. Okay, it's not just about leopards attacking people or bears attacking people or wolves attacking sheep, and we need to work out how to live with these predators. It's also that wildlife, we owe it to wildlife for them so that they can live with us. And so the term that is very popular now is coexistence. And coexistence is defined as a dynamic but sustainable state in which humans and wildlife adapt to living in shared landscapes. I love that because, like these owls, they don't make any distinction whether some area is natural or unnatural. Like the urban owls, you can see here this little family. There's one young owl at the back and an owlet on the side there. They're eating ringtails, and ringtails are quite prevalent in a lot of our urban areas, even more so than in remnant bush. And so that notion of shared landscapes really captured my imagination. So what kind of landscape am I living in? So I thought I'd just show you my house, obviously built before bushfire management overlays. And we have 3 species of possums. We've got antechinus, which is a little type of marsupial, baskergales, koalas, all your typical forest birds, bubuk owls, powerful owls. And just on the side there, you can see a little structure. That's an aviary of rescue domestic parrots. So that's budgies and a couple of princess parrots, and obviously the goshawks think that they're food and all of that. So researching and writing this book is also based on that lived experience. I've been here for about 20 years now. And then this is what my landscape looks like. So I'll just use my pointer. I'm around here in Porcupine Ridge. And so you look at this, and so a lot of people living in cities could go, oh, yes, well, that's all very well. Of course, you're living with wildlife. You've got wildlife all around you. They're living in the agricultural areas. They're living in the forest. But recently, it's not just about bush blocks. Studies have shown that so much of Australia is urbanized, and also threatened species. A lot of threatened species live in our cities. So I am really interested and used the work of I call them wildlife heroes, Dr. Kylie Soanes, Dr. Pia Lentini, and Dr. Jacinta Humphreys. And these researchers and others really are interested in that. It's called urban wildlife, but it's basically wildlife where people are. So, and there's different ways that wildlife and people interact at the moment that's quite interesting and not as well studied. And there's it's called unconventional food sources or habitats. And An example is introduced pines and endangered parrots, such as the ones over in WA, or gangs eating hawthorns, and even swift parrots feeding on spotted gum in car parks and stuff like that. So they're not out in the environment out there, they're living in and around us. Also, these gardens and our parks, our backyards can provide refuges during extreme weather events such as fires. And also, yeah, just looking at that interface between the urban extension, which is not only happening in cities, it's also happening around all of our urban centers. And so the solutions and ideas in the book are really centered on anyone who's living anywhere. So it could be country, could be city. So I thought now I'd go through some really practical examples, and we can discuss what to do with some of these encounters. Now, I bet people have had birds attacking their reflections in window or car mirror. So people think, oh, they're playing or dancing, but birds have a really efficient communication system. So you might have a pardalote might raise its tiny little feathers and go like that, or maybe an eyebrow or some cheek things, and then the other bird will back away, and then no conflict actually happens. But when it's a reflection, the bird in the reflection in the mirror or in the window doesn't back off. And so what that means is that that bird then is absolutely stuck thinking, why won't he, it's usually a male, why won't he go away? And so they keep fighting and fighting. And you can see this pale yellow robin here on a car mirror is incensed, attacking this phantom bird. And one thing to remember is it's not all birds, it's not all species all the time, and it's not all birds all the time. Funny thing happens, like over the 20 years that I've been here, some years we have no birds attacking their reflections, and other years there might be, like just recently we had scarlet robins attacking our car windows for the first time in 22 years. And so the solution was we just put old pillowcases on our car mirrors every time we were going out, and then sorry, when we weren't going out, and then take them off when we go out. And then because they do it when they're breeding, it meant that after a few weeks we could stop doing that, and by then the bird's hormones have settled down a bit, and it wasn't quite as full on. Another solution for birds attacking reflections. So this is my dog Valley. This is in our house. Is so that you can see that there's a tree here, and a grey shrike thrush had seen, it was a female this time, had seen her reflection. And once they've seen the reflection, they can't unsee it, if you know what I mean. So I just got some light colored shade cloth from the shed and put it to the outside of the window. Problem solved. And I did that for a couple of months. Another solution, I love this one. This is the one I did in the kitchen. I call this a clay wash to make it sound kind of attractive. And basically, I live in an area with quite rich clay soils. And so I just get some clay and a bucket of water and just smear it on so the light can penetrate, but the reflection is actually completely eliminated, because you have to cover the entire window, and often you have to cover all the windows in the house, because otherwise your very incensed bird will go and see if that horrible intruder is anywhere else in the house. But if you cover the whole window, I guarantee it works. So this problem with birds attacking their reflections is a problem for the birds, because they're not feeding or defending their territory against real birds. They're not doing, looking after the chicks in the nest. But there's another problem to do with windows that's very real and actually does cause severe injury and death, and that's collision. So I'm sure many listeners here have heard that horrible noise when you hear a big bang and then there's a concussed bird. This bird here, I actually took this quite a few years ago. We were woken up one morning by this resounding crash. I looked downstairs and there were my two dogs on the couch just going, what? And this huge female goshawk was also on the couch, just whoa. And so I put a towel over her and put her in the box, quickly took a photo. And because it was, super exciting to see a bird in such close proximity. If I'd thought about it, I would have put a tea towel on the bottom. And then I put her in a quiet, dark room. And then she seemed very bright. So this is the advice that I used to give. If there was no obvious injuries, like see this bird has concussion, you can see the eyes are like closed like that. You place it in a box with a tea towel in a quiet room, and you don't give it any food or water. And then it's released after an hour or two, but you'll notice I've actually crossed that out, because these days now talking to wildlife shelter operators and veterinarians, just because a bird can fly away doesn't mean it's okay. And so I actually let that goshawk go. And if I'd had my time again, I would have taken it to a vet, because sometimes they have a little bit of swelling on the brain or they've broken a bone up here. But so their flight muscles and wings work okay, but they're actually not well at all. And so I've circled take to shelter or vet there. A very high profile example of this occurring was Christmas 2020. This is one of the Collins Street famous falcons after suffering from window strike. I believe it might have been a glass balcony pane, and had very mild concussion, and it was taken into care at Bulbrook Wildlife Shelter and fed a nice fat quail and then released. So that's a good story, and it would have had an X-ray as well, this falcon as well. So how do we stop this? Look, it actually is quite easy. You just have to weigh up how much you want a perfectly clear window. So a good friend of mine, Janine Duffy, had crimson rosellas hitting her windows all the time. And I told her that you can actually grab a piece of wet soap, and as long as the lines were within 10 centimeters apart, the bird can now see the window. And she had reported 100% solution, no strike rate at all with this temporary solution. And but if you use that rule of having patterns that are no more than 10 centimeters apart, they can be squiggles in this case, or they can be lines. Over in Canada and the US, where bird strikes really a really big problem. They actually use white dots a lot, and they've got all sorts of commercially available films and stuff you can use. But I'm on a Women Birders Facebook page, which is fantastic, and Janine's very active on that. And she came up with these amazing templates. Check it out. So that's a little pardalote, and so she draws the pardalotes, and then their foods. And then she did another one with I think cuckoos and hairy caterpillars, and another one with welcome swallows. So absolutely lovely. And I think a really amazing idea for, schools, for example, that the kids could get involved in doing these patterns on the windows. And people ask me, but what can't you just put up one decal of a raptor? And as far back as 1989, really prevalent researcher in this area, David Clem, determined, no, it's absolutely does not work at all. You need to have the entire window covered, not just one bit in the middle, and you have to have these markings 10 centimeters apart. So let's talk a little bit more about some of your backyard birds. So here's some rainbow lorikeets, and they can very often be victims of window strike as well. And something I forgot to mention is that the in the book, a lot of the chapter on the window strike is actually drew from the Australian Bird Strike Project, which was run by the Urban Birds team, and they produced a report which is available online and really fascinating because no one had actually looked at the prevalence and occurrence of window strike across Australia. So most of the book I did from the comfort of my own home and amazing Zoom interviews and all of that. But I have to admit, when I was studying what it's like to have cassowaries in your backyard, I really did have to go to far north Queensland to go and check it out. And a photo I came across, Ethan Mann, he's fantastic. He took this really quite shocking photo because what you can't see just out of shot is a sign saying $4,000 fine for feeding the cassowary. So I wanted to talk a bit about a really common practice, which is feeding. It's really popular. I know that so many households do it. I just went and stayed with a friend in Queensland, and she was excited to show me that every morning her grey butcherbird came for a little bit of grated cheese. But when I was interviewing the wildlife shelter people and the veterinarians, and also looking at all of the information they give out on their social media pages and instructions, I decided in the book to take a bit of a hardline approach. Just don't do it. And so I'll talk a little bit now about why. So the first reason is that it can cause aggression in animals. And so I've got a picture here. I know it's not a bird. This is a coppery brush-tailed possum reaching for food. And so here I've just got in the caption that there's a really, when you're feeding an animal, it's not actually tame. It's actually overcoming its fear of humans enough to take the food, but it isn't become tame like a cat or a dog. And so when I was studying the some of the risks with having a cassowary in your backyard, if I just go back to this, like, it's quite a big bird, and they can really hurt or even kill humans. When there were studies done looking at attacks of cassowaries on humans, nearly all the cases were because cassowaries had been fed. And cassowaries are incredible animals, but I don't know how smart they are, because their technique of begging for food is to just simply run up to the human and attack them. And I don't think that results in much food, but that's just what they do. And so that's why there's such big fines for not feeding them. And so, yeah. So aggression can be a problem. Another problem is that birds can become delinquents, okay? So when they're fed and they're not going out to forage for their own food, this can happen. So here's some cockies destroying a shopping center facade. And I'm sure everyone's seen all those funny clips of like cockies destroying and chucking down anti-bird spike things, and they do it because they're bored. They do it because they like to exercise their bills, and they also do it because they're really highly intelligent. I've got a chapter in the book on what to do if a cockatoo's destroying the house, and it does sound like I'm exaggerating, but they can cause hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage with their amazing bills. But interestingly, when in Victoria, when researchers such as Ian Temby was looking at the feeding, looking at cockatoo damage, invariably they found that if the person wasn't feeding cockatoos, then someone nearby was feeding cockatoos. So that's a very good reason not to feed cockies. Another very good reason not to feed animals is because of disease. Remember, I told you disease is one of the biggest reasons for animals coming into care, including birds. Well, this happens. So people say, oh, I've seen a very, very old cockatoo. Well, this poor bird is probably only 2 or 3 years, and it has cytosine beak and feather disease, which is caused by a virus. And unfortunately, it's incurable, and it spreads among parrots, and it occurs naturally in the population. Um, but sometimes it causes these really, really hideous symptoms, and the spread of the disease is really exacerbated by this kind of a situation where you see there's spilled seed all around here. The sick bird is standing. Who knows when this dish was last clean? It's a real problem. Um, and another kind of disease that can happen is with magpies. They get actually a nutrient deficiency metabolic bone disease from eating too much of the inappropriate food. So Daryl Jones did write a guide for feeding the birds at your table, because he was like, well, let's just give people information so that they can do the right thing. So yeah, I'm giving mixed messages here, but look, if you do feed, and I think a sprinkle on the lawn is better than using any kind of receptacle. And if you have an aunt or uncle that just won't give the habit up, then you can give them this book. But for all of you listeners, I would say use bird baths instead. You get to help the birds by providing water for drinking and also for bathing. And the added bonus is that you also are providing water for other animals, and you just want to make sure they're very clean. And yeah, you basically, for me, the rule of thumb is you just look after your bird baths the same way you would your pets' bowls and things like that. Another bonus with bird baths is that they can help animals in extreme weather, for particularly heat waves. So these gang cockatoos are cool climate specialists, and they need shade and they need water. And to be honest, I think the hardest chapter for me to research and write was the chapter on extreme heat, because they were talking about the effect of really long, severe heat waves on small woodland birds, and the bird literally having to choose whether to leave the shade and die to reach water or not. It's pretty grim. So water is such a wonderful and essential resource. Another reason not to feed birds is these guys. So the black rat. So I wanted to talk a little bit about rats, and because I've got a section in the book on how to control rodents without harming wildlife. And so I've got some tips here. Rats like continuous vegetation. They also like food. So you can see here, this is actually fallen birdseed that the rat is eating. And they also, they need harbor for all their nests. So it's good to raise your items in the shed. But before you get to any of this, you need to determine whether or not you've actually got black rats. Some people in the bandicoot chapter were finding it hard, sorry, I shouldn't laugh, but to identify a bandicoot, they were mistaking them for rats. And so I had this experience in my own kitchen. So I've got, as I said, Antechinus, and that's an Antechinus being very bold on the chopping board. But you can see its little face is quite different with these little crinkled ears, but they've both got big, cute eyes and long whiskers. One thing that you can do is actually do the crumble test. If you can find their droppings, you'll find that, and this works for mice and bats as well, but that's an Antechinus scat on our tablecloth. But because they're insectivores, those are fragments of exoskeleton, and you can actually just crumble like that. Whereas, and a microbat is also an insectivore, and you crumble it. Whereas mouse and rat poos, they don't crumble; they just stay solid. And so yeah, and then if you don't have access to their scats or you're not sure, then live traps are really recommended by a lot of wildlife organisations, particularly in WA, got a lot of really nice native rodent species. But if you definitely have black rats, try snap traps. And when I was researching over in the US, they really trying to avoid using any kind of super toxic rodenticides, and they had these great tips. You don't just put out one trap, you have this whole thing. This is a runway, and then that way, as the rat's trying to avoid one trap, it goes into the other. And why am I talking about removing their habitat and killing them, reducing their numbers? Because we want to look after our owls. So Act for Birds and BirdLife Australia and Birds in Backyards have really been talking a lot about this, and I know that Holly has talked about this on this forum as well. Because what happens with the second generation anticoagulant rodenticides is that, unlike these guys, racumin, warfarin, sodium chloride, these accumulate in the rat's body and eventually kill them. These ones just kill the animal, the rat, and then they stay in the system. And then when things like snakes or kestrels eat mice, they get directly poisoned. But I hear you say, powerful owls don't eat rats. Well, they eat possums, and often possums eat the bait. And it's pretty sad to say, but it looks like second generation, the SGARs are actually right in the food web, because they've found them in things like red-bellied black snakes that eat frogs and things like that. So yeah, reducing your rodent numbers without using poisons is always the best bet. So just moving along, I wanted to just touch very briefly on cats. So my mum's got an inside cat, 2 inside cats, and they're very happy. And when I researched the cat chapter, I was really impressed by this Safe Cat, Safe Wildlife blog. But I also realized that there's a lot of advocates out there that are saying 24-hour containment is the only way to go to keep the cats inside. People feel very strongly about cats. And if I could show you another animal photo that isn't a bird. So this is a very cute Western ringtail possum. They're critically endangered. There's a population in Albany, and that's over in WA, and they are doing really tough. There's no cat containment laws there. But even partial containment of keeping the cat in during the day would, during the night would help save this species, because they're right on the edge. But all the research points to the fact that what's most important is to work with the cat owners. And so throughout the book, I've tried to write these solutions and techniques in a way that's a bit more like a suggestion or an invitation, and also so that you can pass those suggestions and tips on to parents, aunts, uncle, neighbors who maybe aren't as passionate about wildlife as you are. And just a couple more slides. I also know that people encounter injured wildlife, both when they're out and about driving and also when they're at home. Please excuse the clutter on my front porch. There's a lot less of it now, but I wanted to show this photo because I came home one day and this poor Australian magpie was there, and she she had her head tucked behind her wing and was just there. And I just knew straight away that something was wrong. So I rang Wildlife Victoria, which is my local. So it's always good to have the numbers in your phone before you encounter an animal. And I'll just go through some rescue tips. So first of all, make sure you're safe. If you're on a road, don't, just make sure traffic, because there's no point rescuing animals if the human rescuer isn't safe. Removing pets is always just about the best thing you can do in any situation. That's during extreme weather events when animals are stressed, or if there's like building in your area, like a lot of clearing and animals are dispersing. When animals are injured or unwell, they seem like they're tame, but they're not tame at all. They're stressed out of their minds. And so the best thing is to not take photos of them, not show your kids, get them in a place where you're removing those stressors. So you have a cardboard box and a tea towel in a quiet room is ideal. And then you call a wildlife rescue organization for advice, or you take it to a vet. I still get messages all the time. Tanya, I've got an injured bird. What do I feed it? And I'm like, no, you don't. No. And the analogy I use is that if you were in a car accident, I hope no one's in a car accident, but let's say someone's in a car accident, the paramedics don't arrive with hot pumpkin soup and a cup of tea, because you're stressed, you're injured, your body is in complete shock. You're not feeding it what the birds need more than anything. And this is particularly important for birds. They need warmth. They need warmth and they need those stresses removed. So don't give it any food and water unless advised to do so. And then also, don't keep the bird and care for it yourself. So a lot of wildlife rescue operators are just so frustrated because someone comes in and they've had a red wattle bird that they've been caring for 6 weeks, and they're like, oh, I don't think it's going so well. These native animals require specialist care. Even birds that we think we know about, like galahs, they need specialist care. And so it's really good to reach out and get in touch. And just bear in mind that, as I said, with the rising pressures on wildlife, yeah, they're pretty stressed. And so any way you can support your local rescue organizations by either donating or volunteering is, yeah, really, really important. So I'm going to end there, and then I think we're going to do some questions now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. It sounds like you've had such an awesome experience researching this book and getting to interview carers and scientists and things like that. So it's really nice to hear that synthesis of all of this information in this one kind of way to come at it. It's so cool.
Yeah, thanks.
Also, you mentioned really briefly about how there were some things that you maybe would have done in the past thinking it's the best practice or best way to go, that the process of learning for this book, you realize, okay, I might do things differently if I encounter this situation now. And I think that's really cool to think about. Just because we have this idea of best practice doesn't mean that it will always stay that way. And we are always researching and understanding more about how humans and nature interact and what that means for wildlife. So
yeah,
it's cool to think about that.
Yeah, thanks.
I might start with a question from Moz back when we were talking about glass attacks. So some species, like magpie larks, for example, might attack glass and mirrors 365 days a year. So why are some species like that?
That's a really good question. So the magpie larks, I think because they're always in a territory, they always seem to be paired up. I think they're always vigilant about their own territory, whereas obviously the birds that live where I live, maybe they're much more mobile. That's what I'm thinking. And so that because like if it might depend on the size of their home range as well. So how much they've got to defend. But yeah, I don't know as much about magpie larks as I would like. So yeah, not sure.
But I think that's the thing with all of these kind of rules of thumb. Every species is going to be different with things like their reproductive cycle or whether they're territorial year round or only in the
Yeah.
breeding season. And I think you're totally right. Yeah, magpies are an example of a species that will defend that territory year round. So that means
Mm.
every month of the year, that intruder is perceived as a threat.
Yeah, that's right.
Whereas
And
other
so that
species
means,
say, yeah,
yeah, so that means, sorry to talk over you, that means that unfortunately those measures would have to be tried all year round until maybe a new generation of males was around. I don't know. That's a really tricky one. That is a tricky one.
we'll have to take it to the scientists. We had another question about using playback to deter birds from glass. So one of the people in the chat mentioned that they tried using wedge-tailed eagle playback and they've had their first 24 hours of no contact from a raven in about a month. What do you reckon?
Um, yeah, hi Graham. I know who that is. I haven't had chance to reply to your message, but look, I think that is just that thing of causation or correlation. I think it's a correlation thing because wedge-tailed eagles don't actually prey upon birds. So it's not actually I don't know that it would actually have an effect. Maybe it did. I'm not sure. So yeah, it's an interesting one. I'll have to follow your case very closely, I think, to get to the bottom of it. Because I know ravens are extremely intelligent, so their responses might be different to your average bush bird.
Mm, mm. I think as a woman in science, I would say the sample size might not be high enough for it to be
Yeah, yeah,
conclusive.
that's right.
Yeah. But also, while we mention things like playback, it might be worth flagging that playback can be, it's a very complicated thing to use because different species might react with a lot more fear to the playback, and you might actually be having a bit more of a negative consequence than you anticipate. So with photography, for example, we encourage people to never use playback in
Yeah,
pursuit of things like that. We have
yeah.
a question about keeping bird baths clean. So do you have a general rule of thumb? Could you speak more on that?
Yeah, sure. So in the book, Wildlife Health Australia was a really important source of information, and they've got guidelines on keeping your bird baths really tip-top clean. And I think there's a disinfectant that wildlife carers used called F something. However, I think if you just regularly change the water and you regularly scrub it, that's probably sufficient.
That's good to know. And it's good to know there is a product if people want to seek it out.
Yeah.
What about snap traps? For anyone who maybe hasn't encountered them before, how do they work and what do you do when you catch a rat?
Oh yeah, that was another really hard bit is like where if the rat hasn't died, how do you dispatch of it? So the most ethical way is to hit it on its skull with a hammer. I don't I don't think I could do that. So a friend of mine who's been doing a lot of black rat control on his property said another thing is to put the rat and the trap or the rat that's removed from the trap into a bag and then whip it around like that, and hit it really hard on a hard surface. Um, Unfortunately, I used to think drowning was ethical, but apparently it's not. Because I found, um, yeah, basically, I looked up the animal welfare guidelines and they say drowning is not because it takes a long time. And so you either need someone, a neighbor, or someone who is less faint of heart to do it for you if you can't do the blunt force trauma. The way to go. Yeah.
I know it can be a really uncomfortable conversation to have as well because we're all here obviously because we care about animals. I've done a lot of work with the pest control industry and unfortunately there's no silver bullet that will be lethal to one species but completely safe to another. So this is kind of the best option if you get to the point where controls like cleaning up aren't working.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, capture and release. Some people do that with mice, and the mice that are taken out and then they get eaten by owls and things. I can sort of see that that could be okay. However, do not do that with black rats because they very readily adapt to living in natural bushland areas and also around wetlands, and they just end up feasting on chicks and lizards and other animals like that. They actually are not as commensal, which means living with humans, as they seem. So unfortunately, with black rats, it's best to kill them.
So we're coming on towards the end of the evening, but a question that I like to ask all of our speakers is about kind of what takeaway message you would love for people to get from this evening or from reading your book if they do have it. Like, what action would you like to see?
Well, I think that's a great question. I love it. I think it's I think that what I'd like for people to come away from reading the book or from tonight is to think of animals, it's not just the rare and threatened species that we need to look after. It's also the common species. And if you can use your observation and field naturalist skills to try and work out what's going on with that animal in its life, then you can best apply techniques and solutions based on the animal's needs and hopefully come to it's kind of an agreement in that shared space.
I love that. We have another more maybe hands on the ground question before we end. Is it okay to give bird seed from the supermarket to backyard birds? What do you think?
I would say no. There's a disease called avian gastric yeast that birds get, and it really supermarket bird seed is often low in quality and often not that fresh, and birds like galahs and pigeons and things like that are used to eating a whole variety of different natural foods that they've got to forage for. If you think about like the seeds in a alocasuarina or a hakea or a gum nut, they're tiny. They require a lot of work. So if you're feeding these non-native seeds that are quite fatty, to the birds, they can get like fatty liver disease, but they can also get this yeast buildup, which can make them really quite sick. What happens is they get really skinny. So as fun as that is to feed those birds seed, it's probably best to avoid it if you can, and try and convert your bird passion into just having 7 to 10 bird baths of all different sizes and shapes and look after them, because that's a really fun activity that's completely, well, the risk is massively reduced.
On that very graceful reflection, I think we'll call it there for the evening because it's just come on to 8 o'clock. So Tanya, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for sharing.